Hey, everybody. I sure hope you're having a fantastic day. I'm so looking forward to our biweekly webinar today because it's dealing with an area that, we all deal with. But even more importantly, it's dealing with something we're all either very, very burdened with in our hearts because of how we're wired as pastors, or else it's something that can become really one of the greatest blessings to our life because of how close and supportive the key relationships of our life become. So I can't wait to get into this today. We're going to be talking about conflict management. And sadly, it can allow demonic power to work and to be very, very destructive in a home or very, very destructive in a church family. In fact, Jesus promised us that if we don't handle conflict well, he said the horrible reality is that you're going to lose demonic power and you're going to see the effects of it in a family, or you're going to see the effects of it in a church family. In fact, I'd encourage you after this webinar to go back and read the passage that our guest is going to take us through, but he didn't read the verse after it, because the verse after it literally says that if we do what this happens well, then we're going to loose the bonds of the devil. We're going to loose people of what the enemy's doing. But if we don't do it well, people are going to be bound, and people are going to be held into something that the enemy crafted and that the enemy brought to pass. Basically, it's the scripture where Jesus said, what you bind on earth is going to be bound in the heavens, and what we loose on earth is going to be loosed in heaven. And the word bound, the Greek word translated bound, is deo, and it means to put somebody in bonds like you would a criminal or a prisoner, where they're held in a situation that isn't God's will. And the word loose is luo, and it means to destroy or to dissolve the bonds. And that's what our prayer is today. We hope that God uses this broadcast to change some circumstances where people are bound to bad situations. And we pray that God works in a way that brings greater togetherness and greater partnership. And the reality is we can't always determine that, right? Because people have a will, but the influence that we bring can go a long way in determining how circumstances come out. So I'm really looking forward to today. We have our operations pastor, Matt Mashburn, who's going to be with us. He's going to take us through it. And Matt has not only managed a lot in church. For decades, he's been either an executive pastor, which is often called an operations pastor now, or he's been a COO of public companies. And in addition to that, I'll let Matt correct this if I'm wrong, but I think his parents are both counselors and his brother might be a clinical psychologist. So we have somebody really who's going to help us a lot with this subject that we're dealing with today. So Matt, welcome. Can you give us a little tease, and can you correct anything I said wrong today?
No, you were right on. It is interesting to live in a family where your parents are counselors and your brother's a clinical psychologist. It makes family get-togethers a little more interesting. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm super excited about talking about this today. I've kind of made a lifelong study of people in my professional life, and I find that you learn a lot about people when you deal with conflict management, but I find that it's also a great opportunity to teach people. So I'm going to talk about a pretty commonly understood passage, but I'm not going to preach to you about the passage. I'm going to talk to you about the practical application, hopefully give you some new ideas about dealing with conflict, because if you're in a church, you're going to deal with it.
Yeah, that's so good. And I've looked over your notes, and I'm really looking forward to it. And, Psalm 133 says how good and pleasant it is whenever we dwell together in unity. And unity is obviously more pleasant than disunity. We all know that. But when we come to the end of that psalm, it says, and it's there God commands his blessing. Some people feel good when they win an argument, and God doesn't want us to be that way. God wants us to feel good whenever we're in unity, not just with maybe a controlling person. We'll talk about some of that today. Or, maybe some people fight being that controlling person, and you don't want to do that, but you're trying to hold the organization in unity. And maybe we could listen better. So there's some real skills all of us can learn today. But the ultimate goal isn't to get our way. The ultimate way is to get the Father's way, where his family's in unity and where our family and our church family is walking in a commanded blessing. So we're going to jump right into it and let Matt help you today. But I'm going to do two things real quickly first. First, I want to welcome our new members to the Significant Church Network over these last 2 weeks. Pastor Chuck Allen of Sugar Hill Church in Sugar Hill, Georgia, Pastor Gary Bazinski of Destination Church in Baraboo, Wisconsin, Pastor Nathan Deming from Mount Zion Church in Gansevoort, New York, Pastor Anthony Fail from Solid Rock Refuge Church in Big Sandy, Texas, Pastor Ken Flynn from Out of the Valley Church in Everett, Washington, Pastor Antonio Gonzalez from Life Nations Church in Austin, Texas, Pastor Daniel Jensen from Shekinah Glory Fire Church in Sugar Creek, Missouri, Pastor Andre Matthews from Truth Ministries in Bolingbrook, Illinois, Pastor Scotty McLean from the Impact Center in Auburn, Alabama, Pastor Mark Price from Porter Free Will Baptist Church in Sciotoville, Ohio, Pastor Dan Quagliato, sorry about that, Pastor Dan from Shalom Life Church in Pinckney, Michigan, Pastor Keith Ross from Kingdom Connections Church in Marianna, Arkansas, Pastor Samuel Seals from Johnson Chapel Baptist Church in Gainesville, Florida, Pastor Trent Williams from Miracle Missionary Baptist in Alexander, Alabama, and Pastor Yoel Morales from Havana, Cuba. So we want to welcome all of our new members. And then quickly, I just want to give a partner shout out. And today it's to Pastor Mike and Kim Ewald, who have been dear friends of ours for nearly 30 years. And, you know, they've done just an amazing job at River of Life Church in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Their church was in great conflict whenever they took it over, which is what made me think about them today. They healed the conflict in the church. They raised up a healthy church. They built a very, very healthy family as they did that. And now, you know, they are doing such a great job nurturing pastors. I mean, you know, people who nurture us need to have empathy. They need to be concerned about what we're going through. And they need to have ability, both to help us navigate our challenges and to nurture us so that we become more mature and so God's will is more fruitful in our life. And I thank Pastor Mike and Kim for how they do that. And it's really what Significant Church is all about. It's a network of pastors, and it's for pastors, their families, their church leaders, their volunteers. And we want to serve the church because we know that if we serve the church that Jesus put on the earth, that the gates of hell cannot prevail against the church. So Pastor Mike, Kim, thank you for all you do. And Significant Church wouldn't exist without people like you. Well, Matt, let's go ahead and get started today.
Yeah, first of all, that was a fun list of churches and cities. You know, kudos to you for being able to pronounce most of that. And special shout out to the Impact Center in Auburn, War Eagle. I'm a big Auburn fan. I love seeing that. So, you know, we're going to talk a little bit today about conflict management in the church. And one of the misconceptions about conflict management is that some people enjoy conflict management. And let me say this, nobody enjoys conflict management. I think what's often mistaken as an affinity for conflict management is just the fact that people realize how important it is and that it won't go away on its own. Actually, quite the contrary, it often gets worse on its own. And here's the other thing, conflict is not always bad. Often conflict is necessary in order to find new ways to do things. Often it's to help something bad go away, or maybe even to find something good that would have been missed otherwise. So I don't think conflict it has a bad connotation, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing. It's a necessary thing for us to grow sometimes and teach people. And as Pastor Jim said, much of what I've done is in my various roles is preventative and preparatory. That's kind of that second seat guy's responsibility. And in the same way, my responsibilities have been to limit the damage that can happen with conflict management and provide solutions. But the most important thing that I find is that most conflict is the result of a misunderstanding. Most of the time, it's either a misinterpretation of what someone does or says, it's incorrect third-party information, it's context confusion, when, how, where, who, why. Sometimes we don't understand the context of a comment. And then sometimes it's a lack of underlying knowledge about an issue. So I think those four things can probably account for a large percentage of conflict. And if you realize that, then I think it helps you kind of approach it, because you're not necessarily dealing with two people or a person you're personally in conflict with that are, mean. They just maybe misunderstand something. So, and I know the most commonly invoked passage for managing conflict is Matthew 18. Matthew 18, 15 through 17, it says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of two or three witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. And so I know everybody here is familiar with that passage. You've probably taught that passage. You've studied that passage. But what I want to do is take that passage and kind of give you some between the lines instruction on hopefully helping you deal with some of that conflict. And what I want to do is I want to break it down into the three steps that you see in that passage, which I call the first one, scenario one, the involved person. So let's say you're the person involved in the conflict. Verse 15 says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. Sometimes we have to deal with church conflict where somebody's just frustrated with us. Maybe they misunderstood something that we said, or some of the things that I said above. I think the most important part of conflict and any conversation really is to seek to understand before being understood. The best thing you can do in a situation is to listen first and then talk after. And I think one way to do that is to create well-worded questions that you can use to diffuse the emotion of a situation, because emotion seldom leads to reconciliation. Emotion tends to be raw, not reconciliatory. So here's some guidelines for some well-worded questions. Well-worded questions are not accusatory. They're not meant to help someone feel like they are wrong or that they are at fault. Number two, they're to gather facts, not make a case. Often we'll have questions that we want to start making our case for why we're right. It's strictly you're being inquisitive about what the other person understands. Number three, they're not confrontational. If you start with the questions that are confrontational, you're not going to go in a good direction. You're going to have to unpack that as well as whatever the conflict was. I think this is very, very important, kind of what I said earlier. Great questions must be accompanied by listening well. And here's the best way for you to help somebody understand you're listening well. Take notes. Clearly take notes on what they're saying. It helps you as you figure out how to deal with a conflict, but it also says to somebody, what you're saying is important to me. And I think that helps diffuse it a little bit, because if people really feel like you're listening, they want to work with you to find solutions. And then here's a bonus item. Don't try to answer your own question. That's a diatribe, not a question. If you're asking a question so that you can provide an answer, that's not really a question. So don't try to answer your own questions. It's okay to have a little pause. It's okay for nobody to say anything for a few seconds. Let it hang there a little bit and let them answer the question. Save your answer for the question until later on in the conversation. Now, here's two things that I really, not just in conflict management, that I really try to help my teams understand. Number one is say the last 10%. So many people in the middle of a conflict will get about 90% there, and then they'll say, okay, this went really well. I'm done. I'm not going to do the last 10%. The problem with that is if you don't do the last 10%, you've left something unfinished on the table that you're most likely going to have to come back to, that you're most likely going to have to deal with later. So discipline yourself to say the last 10%. Of course, say it in the right way, but make sure that you've said everything that needs to be said, because you're in the middle of this already. You might as well get the most out of it. The second thing I say to my teams is keep short lists. Now, one of our pastors misunderstood this. He thought I meant keep short to-do lists. And after hearing him talk about it a couple of times, I realized he wasn't hearing what I was saying. But what I mean by keeping short lists is when you have an issue with somebody, deal with it. One thing I tell my teams is if you keep a list, when it comes time that you want to deal with something, you only get to deal with the last thing on the list. The rest of them are up to you. So take a moment and deal with some of the things that comes along, because like I said before, it might just be a misunderstanding. But if you don't deal with it, it compounds, and then it ends up becoming a situation where it is hard to find resolution because you're dealing so many things. Avoiding conflict, never helpful, unless you plan to end a relationship anyway. Here's what I'll say. If conflict will only lead to hurt and the relationship is already lost, that is retribution, not an attempt at reconciliation. If the conflict is not going to solve anything, or if the information you want to share is not going to help the person or help the organization, don't chase conflict. If somebody's left your church and it's something they misunderstood and they're leading in the right way, just let it go. It's not necessary to try to chase down every conflict. So the scenario 2 is the intermediary, which is a very common place that a lot of us find each other. Verse 16 talks about that. It says, "But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses." So as the intermediary, you're responsible for managing both sides of the conflict. It's not to pick a side. Even if one side is right, you must manage both sides so that they both feel cared for and heard, or you'll end up with a winner and a loser. You never want to end up with a winner and a loser in conflict. A win for you is a winner and a winner. Both parties should come away feeling heard, cared for, and growing in their relational skills. Conflict is a teaching opportunity, not a firefighting opportunity. It's an opportunity to help people grow and even become closer together. If we see it as a fire, we'll extinguish one or both parties, and the result will be hurt, not health. So we have to look at it as an opportunity to gain ground in that person's life. So how do we do that? Those are all great ideas, but how do we do that? Here's the first thing I would say. Don't try to express lane the conflict. There is no fast, easy method for dealing with conflict unless it's something very small. You have to follow the formula because in the long run, it'll take less time than having it to do all over again. I forget who said it before, but they said if you don't have enough time to do something the first time, you certainly don't have time to do it twice. And often the express lane approach ends in a winner and a loser, or 2 losers in the process. So here's step 1. Don't go into a mediation uninformed. Meet with each party first, individually. Ask questions to get to the root of the issue. Don't try to guide them yet. Don't try to move them in the direction you think they should based on what you know, but ask the questions. And as a reminder, our well-worded questions are not accusatory, are to gather facts, not make a case, are not confrontational. They must be accompanied by listening well, recommend taking notes, and answering your own question is unproductive. Sometimes the person, when you take them through the question process, will actually realize their part in the conflict and begin to adjust, closer to the middle, because you've just taken them through a process of saying out loud their issue. And sometimes when we say stuff out loud, we realize it's different than what we believe in our mind. Step 2, ask each party what reconciliation would look like for them. If you have people coming into a conflict and they don't know what a win is, there's no way you're going to figure out what it is. So if you have that conversation on the front end and you help them define what a win looks like, there's a much better chance that you're going to leave that conflict with 2 winners and not a winner or a loser, or not an unresolved conflict. If they don't know what a win looks like, you're going to need to help them figure it out. If either party has no interest in reconciliation, you've got more work to do before you bring them together. Don't bring together 2 parties or one party that's not ready to reconcile with another party, because what's going to happen is further damage. Maybe it's time. You might sit down with somebody and say, you know what, I want to help you figure this out, but you might realize that one party's not ready. And you say, hey guys, we're going to table this because we need to be at a place where we enter this conversation with both parties being ready. Once you determine what a win looks like, it's time to get ready for the conversation. And again, you've had this conversation with both parties. So I would coach those parties before you go into the conversation. Give them the right language to use. Give them some guidelines. Talk about the issue, not the person. Stay focused on the current issue. Short list. Remember, they can't come in with a long list. The chances of a good outcome are inversely proportional to the length of the list every time. If it is absolutely necessary to handle more than one issue, make that clear up front and handle them one at a time. Be kind. There is nothing to be gained from posturing, being strong, being loud, being forceful. And again, these are the instructions for the two people coming in. This is not a negotiation. It's a reconciliation. Negotiation is a different topic, and negotiation is a whole different animal when it comes to dealing with people. Once you've defined the issue with each party, coach them how to handle that discussion and feel like the timing is such that a good outcome is possible, it's time for the mediation. So here's some guidelines on what the meeting should look like. Bring both parties to a neutral location. If you bring the parties to a location that feels as an advantage to one over the other, you've already created a hurdle that you've got to overcome that's unnecessary. Find a neutral location where you can do this. Start the meeting by setting some ground rules. Each party will have ample time to share. Neither party should interrupt the other. It is your job to manage the time someone has to speak and respond. You are the mediator. They don't mediate each other. Either party can call for a break at any time. This is very important to say because sometimes it can get tense or difficult, and it's important that people know that if I get in a place where I don't feel comfortable or I don't feel like we're making progress or I don't feel like I'm being heard, I can call a break. The fourth thing is you have the right to end the conversation if it does not seem it's heading toward ultimate reconciliation. And once you do that, the conversation is over until you call the parties back together. So when you end the conversation, they have to agree that we're going to stop until we're able to come back together in a place where we feel like reconciliation can happen. I think the other thing that's important is outline at the beginning, each person will have a certain amount of time to share uninterrupted so that they can say everything they need to say, but keep this in mind. 5 minutes is going to feel like 2 minutes to the person sharing and 10 minutes to the person listening. So you want to pick a time that you feel like is going to feel comfortable for both. I usually give 5 minutes. That way, most people can survive 5 minutes of listening, and that's really what you want to focus on. Number 3 is present a picture of what a win looks like for each party, and hopefully they're achievable. I think it's important to say up front, hey, this is where we're headed. Even if they don't agree on what a win looks like, I think it's important for each party to know that the other one wants reconciliation and to have a sense of where we're going, even if they don't agree with it at that point. Number 4 is summarize each party's position and verify that they're correct. Before you let them talk, do a quick summary of what you understand the positions to be. Very quick, 30 seconds. And then let them have their opportunity to correct or talk about that. And then you'll decide who will speak first. So sometimes this is an opportunity to inject a little icebreaker in there. You can do something fun to decide who's going to go first. You can just decide based on the situation. You can have them pick a number. You can do rock, paper, scissors. You can do thumb wrestling, although that one usually doesn't turn out well. But take a minute to create that little icebreaker moment so everybody can breathe and decide kind of in a neutral way who's going to speak first so it doesn't look like you're taking side. Then monitor the interaction and call it out when guidelines are broken if either party uses emotion for leverage. There often will be emotion, but you can tell if somebody's using emotion for leverage. If they attack the person instead of discussing the issue, very common. You've got to be able to protect each person and focus on the issue. If they begin to repeat themselves, there's nothing to be gained from somebody saying over and over and over what they want because the other person is just going to feel badgered and is going to get frustrated. If somebody starts bringing up things that are not part of the current issue, you got to call it out because they need to stay focused on the current issue. You're not going to solve a list of issues in one conversation. After each party shared, allow each party to ask questions of the other party back and forth until you feel like each party understands the other party's stance. If you've taught them how to ask good questions, they should be able to ask questions of each other to understand their side. Ask each of them again what their idea of a win looks like in case it's changed. Maybe over the conversation, they've decided a win looks different than what it would look like. Ask each person whether they see a way to achieve the other person's idea of a win. This might be where you have to call a stop to the meeting. Say to them, say to person 1, do you feel like there's a chance we can get to person 2's idea of a win? And they may say, either I think we can get to this point, but not there, or they may say, I don't think we can get there, in which case it's probably time to take a break and let them all either let them both think about it for a little while, or maybe it's to take a break for a few days or so. My big thing is keep asking questions, clarifying, moderating until you either reach an agreement or realize that one is not going to happen. If you reach an agreement, make sure you have each party repeat back to you what they believe the agreement is and clarify if they are not on the same page. This is very important. Again, when you say something out loud, it has a different weight. So if I say back to you what I believe the agreement is, I'm much more likely to, first of all, understand it, and secondly, adhere to it. So let's go to scenario 3, take it to the church. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So just a couple of things I want to mention here in closing. I believe the church should be applied to this passage in today's church is the church leadership. I don't think you're supposed to go stand in front of the church and air out your grievances. You're supposed to go to the church leadership, whether it's your staff, elders, deacons, board members, but you need to know beforehand what that committee or organization or group is so that you know where they need to go, so that if it's going to be unreconciled, you can clearly give them direction. Second thing, unreconciled conflict can't be ignored. It is a short path to disunity. Part of the responsibility of the leadership is to make the decision. So when that conflict is brought to that governing board or governing council, whatever it is, they're responsible to make a decision. They can't bury the conflict or pass it off to another meeting. You've got to make a decision so that your church can continue to be in unity. Number 3, act quickly and clearly. So we had a saying at one of my previous church, and it was, we deliberate as many, we speak as one. Discussion happens behind closed doors. Determination should be shared behind one podium. If you can't agree, stay in the room till you do agree. Again, you may have to step away for a while. You may have to take a break, but it's important that whatever your governing council or board is agrees when they walk out of the meeting. And if you've reached consensus, or if not everybody agrees, it's important that that team understand that once we walk out, we're all saying the same thing. And then number 4, provide clear consequences if the determination is not followed. That may be a removal from leadership, restriction from certain ministries, some type of restoration plan, or removal from the church. And number 5 is probably the most important, stick to it. You can't waffle on this stuff. You've got to stick to your decision, because if you waffle and you go back and forth and you keep changing your decision, except in certain cases, it's going to really, really damage your leadership and the way that you're seen. So one thing I always say is I try to provide clear boundaries or expectations, and it's up to the person to decide the outcome. It's not on me. They can choose to respect those instructions and know they're deciding to be subject to the consequences that is on them if they don't. That's not on me. I like to help people make their own decisions, so I try to be clear up front. If you skip number 4 or number 5, clear consequences and stick to it, the poor consequence that may result is on you as a leader or a leadership group. You have to own this. Also, if you're not, just throw this out there, if you're not prayerful throughout the process, you're probably missing out on the best source of reconciliation that you could find. So here's my last thing. The best advice I can give in closing is that conflict avoidance is conflict encouragement. If you avoid it, you're just encouraging it to happen.
Wow, that was so good. Really, really good. And I'm glad this is archived, because there's a lot of great information in there, a lot of great bullet points that going back and listening to it again could be really, really helpful. I just want to share Tamara and I's experience for just a minute, because Matt talked basically about 3 things. Number 1, you're involved in a conflict, right? I mean, whether you want to be or not, you know there's a conflict going on. And if you ignore it, it's only going to get worse. It's only going to spread. It's only going to cause there to be more damage. And I know that I've seen that. I know you've seen that lots of times. And I just want to say this, that part of the reason it exists is because, we as Christians sometimes, we fight morally for our opinion. And I think even the whole evangelical charismatic movement, we basically brought accurate opinions to the body of Christ, right? But sometimes that part of us that stands for things or stands for what we think is right is the very thing that makes conflict resolution so difficult. And so the first thing I'd say about that is that some environments are really big on honor, but they're really poor on communication. So, or I could say it this way, they're really big on control, but they're not good on communication. Other environments are really good on communication, but things go into chaos because there's just not good control. And when you're in conflict management, the people who are good at finding the middle line between control and communication are the ones that win. They're the ones that find the unity that Psalm 133 talks about, that causes things to be pleasant, causes God to command his blessing. Doesn't mean we can control that all the time, but even in our homes, if you take Ephesians 6, and it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment, with a promise that it may go well with you and that you'll enjoy a long life on earth. Think about that verse. Obey your parents in the Lord. Don't be too controlling. The Lord's in control, not you, parent. So there you have communication. We're trying to learn to follow the Lord together. But then it says, but honor your parents, which is the first command with a promise. Did you notice that honor is a commandment? So if we're going to be controlling about anything, let's be controlling about honor, not controlling about everybody doing things exactly the way that we see it. Because division just means there's two visions. And that can either lead to a broader, better perspective, or that can lead to division and devilish work. So I just want to add that I've found that, hey, we all get involved with conflict because there's division. There are people that see things different ways. Don't be overly controlling, and don't be so communicative you lose control. Look for that center line, and you'll feel God's pleasure, and you'll find God's blessing whenever you do that. The other thing I just want to say about this subject is a lot of people won't even go to step 2. You're involved in a conflict and they won't even go to the intermediary stage. And that's really, really sad whenever that happens, but it's common. And when that happens, you just, then you find yourself at step 3. And that is you have to make a decision. And I think it's interesting that Jesus talked about tax collectors, and he talked about, treat them as you would a Gentile and a tax collector. A Gentile, first of all, is somebody who's not a believer. So if somebody really won't meet, won't talk, won't let biblical perspective bring you to unity, then treat them like somebody who just doesn't really honor the Bible. And that just means you might have to set some boundaries because they want to control you. They want to just get things their way. And in the end, a lot of people are willing to damage you to get their own way. And sometimes when people are damaging you, the right thing to do is just submit, The Bible talks about it. Like I'm reading Jeremiah now. And the people were going to be oppressed by Babylon. But you know what? Jeremiah said, put up with it, because the result's going to be worse if you rebel. So sometimes we just need to learn to smile, keep working that job we're working right now, keep doing it in spite of the fact that things aren't fair. But then there will come a day when God blesses you, and you don't have to put up with that oppression anymore. So I just encourage you, treat them like a Gentile. Jesus wasn't just throwing words out there without purpose and meaning. Or treat him like a tax collector. What was a tax collector? That was somebody who was of the same tribe as Israel, but he sold himself out to the Romans, and he did it so that he could benefit himself. They were the most despised people in Israel. So when someone will not go to intermediary, either it means they don't really want to have a biblical discussion, or it means that they're a tax collector. They're just thinking more about their own benefit. And you know what? I'm doing fine. I can control you, or I can't control you. But obviously, the relationship isn't the biggest thing on their mind, right? Whenever they won't come to the table and solve things. And there are times whenever you've done those 3 things, I'm involved in a conflict, I've gone privately, I've tried to work it out. I tried to invite people to have an intermediary. They either refused it or whatever happens. Then you just got to come to a point of decision. And boy, did Jesus give us great advice. And then the next verse, again, I hope you read it. basically says what you bind on earth will be bound in the heavens. What you loose on earth will be loosed in the heavens. That the decision we make will either bind people to circumstances or it'll loose people from what the enemy was up to. And I just want to say this in closing. Don't feel bad if you have conflict that you have to manage. In 2010, Tamara and I literally spent 40 hours a week and lots of money because we wanted to be really good at managing conflict. And we've had 2 seasons in our life that were difficult. One was within the church, one was not within the church. Just had to do with things that were happening on a family front. And boy, the only thing I felt when I got done was I wish I had done this earlier. Sat down for 40 hours, learned what Jesus taught about what to do, and just did my part. Because he'll always bless you on the other side if your heart is the kind of heart that wants to obey the things that he asks us to do. So again, I'm really glad this is in the archives. I want to encourage you, if you know a pastor who really needs help with this right now, would you share it with him? Would you call him and say, man, I really think this webinar will help you? Because at the end of the day, we really are our brother's keepers, guys. And if we don't care for our friends, nobody else is going to care for our friends, right? So let's make sure we care for our friends. Well, we're going to close this webinar with 3 questions, Matt. So I hope you're ready for these questions. Question number 1 is, I've had someone who caused conflict on and off for years, and we're usually able to resolve it, but it's disappointing that it keeps arising, the same conflict. Is there a point where it's better to move on from a certain relationship in these kind of situations?
Yeah, I think you have to really be open to the fact that not everybody belongs at your church. Not everybody belongs there. Maybe there's a better place for them. And I think if somebody continues to have conflict over and over, they're either unhealthy personally, and that could be the case, or they're just in a church that they're not happy with, and it's okay to find a different church. So I don't think you have to go through it over and over and over again, because that means somebody's not growing. And if they're not growing, they either need a new teacher or they need a new environment. So I think you have to really reach a point where you say, you know what, why is it that we keep going through this, and help them decide, how to move forward. What's the best place for their family and for them? And one of the books I'm going to recommend is called Necessary Endings by Henry Cloud. And it's a book really about staff situations, but I believe it's a great book because when you get to that step 3 and it doesn't work, that this is a book that talks about how you help people come to an end of their staff situation, but I think it can also be their church situation, because it's like I said, one of the things that I like to say to people is, here are the expectations, here are the guidelines, this is what happens if you don't follow them. Now it's up to you. And that book does a great job of helping understand how you can take people through that process, because sometimes it's just not the place they need to be.
Yeah. And you said this well. You said ignoring things seldom leads to a good end, and I agree with that. But, codependency doesn't lead to a good end either. It just clouds things, and problems tend to live on if there's codependency without a good, solid, okay, this is what you believe, this is what I believe. And honestly, necessary endings may sometimes last 2 to 3 years, and you may get a second shot when there's a necessary ending. We didn't say a necessary conclusion. We just said a necessary ending, and I think there's a difference to that in that. Here's a second question. I feel like there's enough conflict out there that I could probably deal with it as often as I'd like to. I like that. Dr. Cho said, when I get to forgive people who trespassed against me, he said, man, I could spend all day on that. He had a church of 1 million people. So there's a lot of conflict out there. How much time do you put in your schedule for dealing with conflict? Great question. Matt?
What I try to do is prioritize conflict. One of the things we do well at Faith Family is we follow the Moses model in our leadership. And I think that can be applied to conflict also. If you're trying to resolve all of the conflict, you're going to be Moses, running out of time to handle it all and also being exhausted. So there are people in your church that are probably have the right temperament for this, might even be better than you at resolving the conflict. And that should be part of your elder team, part of your board, but there may be other people who are comfortable doing this. Let other people serve in that way, because often there's people that is their gift, is discernment and their ability to help people find common ground. So I think you really have to deal with as much of the conflict as you can, but you don't have to do it personally.
Yeah, that's really good. And I'm just going to say this, where we're weak, sometimes people step in with products that aren't that great, and they make a lot of money and they don't solve much. That's just reality. And this is an area in the church that I think that's probably true. It's easy to maybe hire an outside organization. You feel like at the end, all that really happened was they told everybody to be nice to each other. But resolving conflict in families and in churches, it's much more difficult than that. And that's why Jesus not only went through those 3 steps, which aren't necessarily easy steps, but he also talked about the stakes of what happens if we do or don't resolve conflict. And so I think that's really, really good. I think that local churches in the future are probably gonna see the wisdom in finding people in the church with the spiritual gift of resolving conflict. Okay, Matt, last one. Here we go. You already mentioned Necessary Endings. Do you have any other books or resource recommendations on this topic?
Yes, I think there are 2 main factors to conflict management. One is setting boundaries. The other is understanding people. So Henry Cloud has a whole series of books on boundaries. He's got a boundaries for teens for your student pastor. He's got boundaries for marriage. There's all kinds of books on boundaries. I think if you can learn the art of setting boundaries, you can be a fantastic conflict resolver. I'm going to make up a word here. The second one I would say is understanding people. And John Maxwell wrote a book many years ago called Winning with People. And I believe it's the best book that's out there that I've read about how to understand different types of people, because you have to adapt. It's also what I use as a management tool. You have to adapt to the person you're leading, whether it's a staff member, a volunteer, or somebody that you're leading through conflict. So whatever you can do to understand different types of people and how to communicate with them is a big step toward finding those answers. So those are a couple of resources I would recommend.
Yeah, that was really well put. And the only resource I'd add to that is if you look up the Peacemaker material, they take what Matt talked about in Matthew 18 and they basically the books about it. So if you want more detail and if you want to feel like you're really well prepared, Peacemakers, the organization has done a lot of good. Our courts bring them in to resolve conflict a lot of times in high net worth families and that kind of thing. So I would encourage that book as well. But then I'm just going to say this in closing, and we'll let everybody go. But Peacemakers had a split. Can you believe that? The Peacemakers organization had a split. And I guess that's why Jesus said, as much as it's possible, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with all people. Isn't it interesting? Jesus said the things impossible with men are possible with God. But then when it came to unity, he said, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with all people. So just know this, that doing right doesn't mean you're going to solve the conflict every time, as much as it depends on you. But you know what? It sure makes our hearts feel a lot more like Jesus whenever we try to, really get along with God's family and really get along. I remember, I was raised Catholic, and when I came to faith, it caused some conflict in our family. And I remember saying to my mom, I'm sorry, Mom, because I know how hard you've worked to build a family. And I didn't want to stand for the truth and cause issues in your family. I'm sorry for that. It just blessed her heart, right? We saw things different. I'm who I am today, and a lot of my family have come to it. Some of them have not. But there's just something great about having a heart that loves family. So guys, thank you for being a part today. Hope this was a blessing to you. It's our heart. We want to serve pastors. We want to help pastors, their families, their leaders, and their teams be stronger because of what we do here every 2 weeks. We like this to be our lunch appointment with you where you feel like, man, it was great. I'm glad I got to go out with those people and hear some things. We'd like to bring great people to you who have a lot of expertise on the subject. But listen, knock it out of the park. We'll be back in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about things I wish I knew when I was a young pastor. Going to be a fun seminar. Mark Harrell, Pastor Mark's going to be with me in 2 weeks, and I know you're going to enjoy that. So blessings. Have a great weekend.